Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly O'Horo, and this is Adaptable, Behavior Explained. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so happy to have you here on Adaptable, and the conversation we're going to discuss today is about having adopted and foster children and some of the impacts and ramifications that exist when having that kind of family system, and hopefully a lot about what people may or may not know related to trauma and how it impacts children who are adopted and fostered, not sometimes, but always based on their early time. And personally, this topic is important to me because I am a mother of 5 children, 3 were adopted. They were my husband's, and then one that occurred to our family later in his adolescence, and then we have one biological child. So I have a very hodgepodge group of people and a lot of experience personally on this topic, as well as being an attachment specialist and trauma specialist. But I'm very excited to introduce to you our guest for today, and that is Megan Stanbury. Mm-hmm. And she is an expert in her own right in trauma, and she's got a medical background as well as being a mother. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and why this topic is important to you to share with our audience.
Yeah, well, by trade, I'm a CRNA, so I do anesthesia for a living. My husband's also in the medical field. And then we have 2 older adopted boys. We adopted when they were a little bit younger, but school age. And then 2 biological children that are younger. We always wanted to adopt. And kind of after our training, we weren't spring chickens anymore. We weren't old, but we weren't, young. And it was kind of around the time.
You mean training for your profession?
Right.
Okay.
And it was time to start a family, but I didn't feel quite ready to have a baby yet. And so adoption always wanting to be something that I wanted to do.
What do you think primed that desire, like growing up or in your own family? What made you decide I want to adopt children?
I don't know. It was just always there in the background. I didn't really, I can't think of, we had a few friends maybe growing up that adopted kids or that were adopted, but, I don't know, just something that was always in my heart, really. Mm-hmm. And, I think there's a faith aspect of that too. And so the timing of it, I say I wasn't ready to have a baby, but I think maybe that desire was, sort of maybe quelled for that time because, mm-hmm. the children that we ended up adopting, they were there at that time and it needed to happen then. Mm-hmm. So, I believe it all works out.
So tell us, how did you know they were your kids? I mean, what was that like for you when you adopted?
Well, we started the kind of the journey inquiring, and then we found a place that we wanted to work with. And then just randomly, the adoption specialist, we were kind of still in the very early stages. She invited us to come to a Heart Gallery photo shoot, which is where they put the children who have already been severed from their parents online so that, you can kind of, if you're interested in adoption, you can look from afar, see what the kids are like, their ages, the things that they're interested in. So maybe you can match up a little bit better, before meeting kids. And so we were invited to go to that because there were 2 of us, and then our adoption specialist also came. We were paired up with a group of 3. And, we spent the whole day with them. You ask them questions. They, get new clothes and have their pictures taken and eat with them and just had the best time. But at the end of the day, when we were saying goodbye to them, they walked away and I just knew, like, those are my kids. I didn't go there that day at all thinking I was going to meet, any kid that we were planning to adopt. But
that process sounds really stressful for a child, almost like show and tell.
Mm-hmm. But if you think about, the way that we can get them exposure so they're more likely to be adopted, I think that's the motive behind it. But I agree with you that it does.
Like, did they pick me? Was I good enough at our fancy lunch and my new clothes?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't think I realized that's how the process went when it comes to, in some place, I imagine different agencies do it different ways.
Yeah.
But wow. So they really pulled on your heartstrings for sure.
Yeah. And they were so much fun. I mean, I think we just immediately fell in love with them. But again, I think it was also just meant to be.
Right. What made you decide to do biological children after having adopted?
I think a few reasons. One was, just not being ready to have a baby yet. I really wanted to feel ready for that. But also, maybe that if we went ahead and had biological children, that we'd get too busy and then it would just never happen.
Meaning you wouldn't adopt afterward.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you really wanted to make sure that happened.
Yeah. It just felt like it was the natural progression in our story. But I think there's so many different ways that families look and, you don't want to think, well, I already had my bio kids, so I guess I can't adopt now.
Right.
It could go many different ways.
Sure. And there's pros and cons to having them in either order.
Yeah.
I can see advantages where if you have adopted children first, then biological children don't grow up thinking, why wasn't I enough? Why did you adopt children? And, the dynamic of our family changed substantially based on, the topic we're going to talk about next, which is their adverse childhood early experiences and how that impacted the way their behavior is because of their own early experiences. And that's upsetting perhaps in some family systems where adopted kids come after biological children, and then adopted children can feel burdensome and biological children can feel slighted in that their homeostasis was somehow upset.
Yeah.
So I can see where if biological children, and that's what happened in my case, my older children were first and they were the adopted children. They were not my biological children. And my youngest was born, a couple of years after I've already had the adopted children. Mm-hmm. And so they were just his brothers. Like they didn't know anything different. And it wasn't until I think he was 7 or 8 where we had a conversation about how they're your brothers and I love them and they're my boys, but they didn't live in my tummy.
Right.
And I can remember the look on his face, like, did I live in your tummy? Like where did I come from? There was some confusion, but otherwise it was pretty much a non-issue for him. It was like, they're his brothers and that is whatever it is. And, whereas they felt differently about him because they were not of me. And so they could feel the difference with him.
And we waited, once I have 2 older boys, and once they were more stable, then, we asked them, how would you feel about having a little brother or a little sister? And they were so excited, so then.
It's like a family decision also.
Yeah. And I mean, they are so, so good with them and they're just so close. And it's been wonderful to watch. And then when we had the conversation of, because my next to youngest saw me pregnant, so he understands, coming from a tummy, but I feel like, when we had the conversation of like, the older boys didn't come from my tummy. It was like, okay.
Yeah. And moving on.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was pretty fast. Like I said, in my house too, it was just, you're our parents and that's all it is. So the youngest had a little bit of a different experience. I have to say that for him, the feeling closeness and the connection he felt to his older brothers was always there. I mean, and for the most part, they really treated him with a lot of love and adoration. But I think that, I don't want to speak specifically for them, but there has been some language around envy or around jealousy, and not necessarily like he is better, but he had it differently.
Right.
And so he acts differently and has a different level of confidence because I got to start with him, whereas I didn't get to start with the others. And so they didn't have the same level of secure attachment.
Right.
And that kind of leads us into the segue of the conversation about adverse childhood experiences and how that impacts our overall behavior and wellness and physical health in later life. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and maybe if you could share some things you've seen as a mother and in other families that you've known with adopted children, some of the things that you've seen that we will know are the result of that early stuff that they had to go through, see, or witness,
Yeah.
So with ACEs, for those of you who are not familiar, it's the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. It was done out of San Diego. Kaiser Permanente conducted a study with 17,000 medical participants, and they asked them 10 questions about their early adverse experiences, and there's 10 items on this thing. And some of them have to do with emotional neglect or abandonment. They have to do with physical danger or violence, being, a parent being incarcerated. And unfortunately, some of these things, drug use in a parent, some of these things are why children end up in the system, whether it's foster care or end end up being adopted. Not everybody is accidentally pregnant at 15 and chooses to put their child into an adoptive situation. And, that's not how it typically works. And so what I have seen as an attachment specialist is those early years where 0 to 3 or 5 or whatever those children are experiencing, whether it's just simply a mother who feels anxious, overwhelmed, sad, and full of shame that she cannot keep her child when the child is born. Babies feel that, but there's also all of the things that happen once child is born, whether it's being passed to different foster homes and now the care and the structure is inconsistent and I'm feeling like I'm not wanted here and then I'm passed here and I'm not wanted here. So it creates a very unsettled, emotional, nervous system where I am unsafe and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop and I can't rely on being wanted, loved, cared for, and I can't trust it. And so that really rattles a person's nervous system because we're not really meant to not be raised by our biological parents when possible. That's just not how our species is designed. So what have you seen as far as behaviors that you could express or talk about that you are like, I know this is from that and this is what they experienced and saw, just so people understand a little bit better, because parents oftentimes judge behavior and they don't understand why the behavior exists because they don't have the training and the learnings from a trauma lens.
Well, and I think when you bring a child into your home that you haven't raised from the start, or maybe you have, maybe if they were adopted at a young age, but or maybe you could even be surprised by your own biological children by their behavior too.
Very much so.
But if you notice something that doesn't seem right or doesn't line up with, maybe something that's age appropriate or appropriate with the amount of, food that you have in your home, or, something that doesn't really make sense, just instead of
based on the now.
Yeah. Instead of just, saying something to them, first ask yourself maybe like, what might have happened in their life that would make their behavior different in this situation or make them not feel safe. Because there's so many different scenarios that can happen where they can be triggered, and, we all can be triggered by, all kinds of different things. But, where you're kind of taken aback and you ask yourself like, oh, this might be something, that is affecting them from the past, and just approaching all of those things with compassion and understanding, because they may not have the skills yet to cope with those things, to even understand why they're behaving like that.
I think it's also not taking personally the reactions and behaviors that you see, and trying to approach with more curiosity. I want to share an example. There's a little bit of shame associated with this example because I still feel badly about how I reacted to a behavior that I saw in my home. And, the first of which is my oldest, there was food scarcity in his early years. My husband was in the Navy and there was a lot of neglect by their biological mom, and they didn't have enough food. And so there was tremendous competition around food and scarcity, and they didn't always have what they needed. And so he's in my home and I have plenty of food, and, we don't have abundance, but we have enough. And he was eating with his arms around his plate. And I was so judgmental, and I was so not compassionate and curious about his behavior. And I was like, why are you eating like this? This isn't good manners. Why are you eating with his arms around it? And he would watch to see that he could finish his first serving before everyone else finished, so that he would be able to go back for seconds and not have it be gone. Mm-hmm. And when it finally clicked, I was just like, oh my gosh, I am a monster, because I was so shaming and disrespectful and not curious to him, and I didn't get it. Yeah. And once I corrected it, I was like, honey, you're always going to have enough. It might not be, the chicken nuggets, but I'll always make you a sandwich. There's going to be enough food. You're not going to go hungry anymore, you know? And as soon as he heard me get it, and he saw that, I saw a softening. Yeah. And I said, is it okay if I remind you when I see you doing things like protecting your food, would it be okay if I just brought that to your attention? And he was like 8 at the time. And it was like an exchange or a moment where he understood that I saw it. I understood why he was acting that way, and he settled. And then there was a lot less anxiety around, needing to finish first so he could get seconds before it was gone. And so those are the kinds of things that I think people just don't think about.
Yeah. I think being seen, him being seen in that situation really helps, or just him being able to make that connection too.
Yeah, because we're not aware of how we're reacting in a trigger ever. We're just surviving. We're surviving this moment in fear that the bad things are going to continue to happen or going to happen again.
Yeah, and you could also tell him 20 times and he's still not going to understand.
Well, that's the other piece is I knew that just corrective behavioral action was not fixing anything. So that's where, it just wasn't.
I mean, that's where, therapy can help a lot. And also just all of those things in their past, all of their adverse experiences to be part of their story.
Like in an honoring way.
And for that to be okay. Yeah. Because they're going to, depending on the age and the situation and all those things, they're going to approach those things differently, right? There may be some that can feel all their feelings right away and they'll work through it and, then they feel fine about it. And there's some that are going to numb and they're not going to want to talk about it. And it's in the past and, and you're like, oh, this is going to...
My experience with that has been that the younger they are removed from those situations, the more accessible those emotional experiences are. Whereas if they saw a lot and experienced a lot, they tend to be more numb because they needed to practice adaptations that shove it down and repress it because they had no other option. They couldn't get away. They couldn't fight. Their words didn't matter.
Yeah.
And so they were just going along and getting along to the best of their ability. And so personally, my experience in that is that if they're older, they've seen more.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of parents make the mistake of going, well, I got them and then I changed everything and it was great. And I don't know why, and I think that's the biggest thing that I see with especially when I see the parents of people who adopt, it's like nothing of this has to do with you.
Right.
This has only to do with their nervous system and how they're interfacing with the stimulus based on what they have already lived through before you got them.
Yeah, not taking that personally. And I think going into adoption too, that you have to know that it really has to be all about the child. Right. I mean, it can't be about you at all.
No. And they may never be able to fully love and embrace the love you've tried to provide for them because their nervous systems don't allow for that surrender. Because, depending on what they went through or saw or how young they were when you got them, they might be waiting for you to give them away as well.
Right.
And they don't know it, and they may know that you're not, but they physically that doesn't necessarily match up. And so there's this overwhelming fear, like I'm not going to matter as much, and it's only a matter of time until I too lose that secure connection. That not always, but this is part of their potential.
Yeah, there's a huge spectrum of kids who are able to adapt and ones that aren't, and ones that are going to feel loved but don't want to talk about it, and ones that want to talk about it but don't feel loved. And I mean, it's just going to span a huge range. But going into it knowing that, they may never be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for adopting me and I love you so much. And,
you saved me and you're a hero.
Yeah.
It may not.
It may not happen, but, you're, at a minimum, you're going to get purpose and meaning out of being their parent. And if you have, love to give, that's really what they need the most.
Sure. And that unconditional acceptance of whoever they are at this any given moment in time. And truthfully, the willingness and the resources to give them adjunct support if you don't know really what to do with it.
Yeah.
I think that's another factor when you choose to adopt is recognizing that mental health and trauma support are very likely going to be part of the team that needs to be how you choose. How do I choose to adopt? Can I afford to get some really good trauma counseling and to make sure all of my emotional ducks are in a bit of a row so that I have appropriate expectations and I have the bandwidth to support a child who's been through the ringer before I even got into the picture. And I don't think there's enough education around that prior to choosing adoption.
And there's some, there's some books that can be read and things like that to kind of prepare yourself too, if you're really interested in, trying to help them through that. I think there's, resources when you're fostering to adopt. I think, doing your own work is a really good
That's one of the things I respected the most about you. And you're talking about that is just how that was a priority for you. Like take care of your own business before you.
There's no way I would have been able to be the mom that I am now had I not done my own work first, for my adopted kids and my bio kids. Like I'm so grateful for that. I just wouldn't have had the knowledge. I wouldn't have had the patience, the understanding, and for no matter what child you have, a lot of that is required with parenting.
Oh, for sure.
So,
biological or otherwise.
Yeah.
I mean, if we don't have our own nervous system in order, we are not going to show up our best selves. And it's so hard not to personalize behaviors. I mean, even when people are babies, I see parents, why are they doing that? And I'm like, it has nothing to do with you. I assure you. Their temper tantrum on the floor isn't about you. It's about them not getting the second cupcake. And so taking that personally or feeling embarrassed by it is not useful because it's just not about you. So being able to do enough of your own work so that you can not personalize actions and address them in a more measured way with compassion, with curiosity, I think is the golden
yes,
ticket.
I don't want anybody to underestimate that part of it, because there's so much of it that you could take personally, and you just can't. It's just about loving them and helping them through, their journey.
Do you mind sharing some personal examples with how you've seen the earlier years with ruptured attachment, because you got your kids a little bit older, and how that impacted their actions or behaviors?
I think one thing that I remember is just, it's natural for all of us to want to know where we came from, who our parents are, who our grandparents are, our ancestors, all of those things. And, you can't be like, you're a part of this family now and that's over. Like, definitely not. But you also, you can't take personally if, wanting to be with or know about, bad people. It just has to be approached with compassion and understanding. Because you have to think about what you would want if you were in that same situation. You would be super curious. You would want to know if you didn't have access to, or you had limited knowledge of where you came from. That's a huge part of our story.
We are carrying the genetic aspects of our story for 2 generations. So there's an internal knowing about what was experienced in our parents. And even if we can't make sense of it, we have a sense of. And I mean, I've even seen this with children who are adopted from orphanages in different countries like China or Russia, where they have this deep desire to understand better about their culture, wanting to go back to visit, their home countries and learn more about why they feel and act the way they do and have better understanding about it. And I think that should be really celebrated, actually.
Even if you, didn't come from an adopted family, you still are, curious about generations before you. So I think, wanting to be with or wanting to know about or any of that has to be, you really have to be just open to that and willing to let them love or miss, anyone they need to love or miss for as long as they need to love or miss them.
And not take that personally.
No.
And even if there's some fantasizing about what it might have been like or been like, and I think it's okay for children to be told as much truth as you can in a compassionate way. Yeah. I think oftentimes we try to protect children from their histories and saying, they loved you, but it just wasn't the right time, when in fact dad was in prison and mom was abusing drugs. I think it's important that they know those things, because those factors make more sense as to why they were not equipped, where their own emotional capacities were not sufficient to raise you. It wasn't that they didn't love you. They might have loved you very much, but they just didn't know how to love themselves enough to create stability to provide you the home that you deserved. Yeah. And that's more about their mental health insufficiencies as opposed to love and you're deserving. And so I think that a lot of times people try to sugarcoat histories, and it's not useful because we have an implicit understanding of things that went on, even as early as in utero. And so I think that is a mistake oftentimes that is made for parents when trying to manufacture the picture of the history.
Yeah, I agree. Just letting them in on as much information as is age appropriate, because they need information and context and learning, and they understand more than you think, and have maybe have seen more than you even know. And so just to put all those pieces together is helpful.
Can you share some of the experiences you've had related to some of the emotional struggles that you've experienced that your children have experienced, because they were different ages when you adopted them, and what that looked like as far as behaviors, and then what you guys did to address them?
I think, it kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier, that, we had 2 very different kids, from the same situation because their ages were so different. And
Just like with biological kids,
Right.
My son had different parents than, my daughter, perhaps because I was older, we had more money, whatever else, I was more mature, I'd done some therapy. So they got a very different set of parents, and that affects the way a child shows up, adopted and not adopted.
Yeah. I think, when you get these kids that you don't really know anything about in the beginning, that some of their behavior may not seem age appropriate, or you might think, well, they're acting like, that much older or much younger. And so, when they're, a certain age and they're having a tantrum, and you're thinking like, shouldn't this be, worked out by now? And it's like, well, no, their brain may be still in that's, at that age when it comes to this specific situation, or not feeling safe, or feeling like they have to fight for resources, or, whatever the case may be. We're trying to create those connections that we're suffering, and that never the connections of like safety and love and
building
resources.
New pathways that are different than the pathways that were already built in their brain.
Yeah, and that takes time. It definitely takes time. So, for us, it was almost like, okay, I know how to handle this. If this child was this age, so I'm gonna, in this situation, treat them like they are this age, and love them, and shower them with love and affection through it, and then they're able to
meet them at the developmental show. So if I'm 15 but I look like I'm 4 because I've had this temper tantrum that looks very, very young, then we would come in with a parent intervention that has to do with addressing a 4-year-old. Yeah. Even though you're looking in front of you at a 15-year-old.
Right. You can't say, get up, you're acting like a baby, or any of that. I mean,
because they have developmentally and emotionally regressed, because that's how trauma works. I regress to an age and state specific experience based on when something like this that activated that part of my behavior and memory network, as if I'm still 4. And so we get stuck in trauma time, and I think a lot of parents don't understand that. They're 15. They should ... whatever that is. And it's like, well, actually, they look, developmental age 6, calendar age 15.
There's no shoulds and supposed tos in these scenarios. And so it's just really meeting them where they're at. And if you're surprised by their behavior, again, like we were talking about earlier, maybe take a step back and think, what could have, happened in the past that would, make this
evoking that.
Scary for them.
So because children who are adopted or have been fostered oftentimes come with pretty significant trauma histories, how would you describe trauma-informed parenting?
I think especially for those kids, they need to feel like they're in a home that is safe. And when they see, parents who are disagreeing, or there's, instability somewhere, that can be destabilizing for them. And so for us, especially in the beginning, we're not having huge conversations over big things or arguments in front of them. It's definitely important for them to see that over time, because they need to see, parents talk, parents disagree, or
conflict,
whatever.
Constructive tension, and then resolution and repair, of course.
But in the beginning, they need to see a united front, and especially obviously know, gaming one parent or over the other or whatever. So there's so much that needs to happen between the parents, talking about the rules and, consistency, and how are we going to approach this, and, having those conversations, and that's why it's also important to reconnect, often, so that, you're not, all this stuff isn't happening and then you guys haven't had a chance to talk about it or whatever. But having a united front, having those conversations maybe in private for a little while, and then progressively opening up to them and doing those kinds of things in front of them.
And how can we support children with these trauma histories?
I think a huge thing for our family and our kids was just being consistent, and making your word as good as gold, because it's very likely that they're not going to believe anything you tell them for a very long time. And so if
trust is hard to establish and
build.
you
have to earn it. Yeah. And so if you're saying one thing and doing another, or saying, we're going to go, here on this day, and then you don't, and then it's like, oh, here's another adult that's just lying to me. Or, if you break this rule, then this is what's going to happen. And then you're like, no big deal. It's just like any other kid, they're going to take it and run with it. So it's super important to make your word as good as gold. Whatever you say is what needs to happen, and
don't be impulsive with it.
Yeah. And that's
slow down and go back and go, what is it that I want to deliver? Because I really need to hold to this.
Yeah. And that's day after day after day. And that can get tiring too. And also, something that maybe I wouldn't have appreciated before I did my own work was, if you've told them something and now you're freaking out because it can't happen, just telling them, well, I wanted to do this, but this happened, or I had to change my mind because this happened, because they also need to know they have permission to change their mind about something. Right. So, but for the most part, being consistent and doing what you say you're going to do every single day for a very long time is so important for them to earn trust and to believe that there's people who will tell them the truth.
And on the topic of earning trust, a metaphor that I often use for anyone, not just adopted children with attachment, is if we were to think about our vessels, ourselves as a jar, and moments that people exhibit, this is a Brene Brown-ism from Daring Greatly content, but if you were to put marbles in a jar and for each moment of a trust building experience from people, and those marbles eventually build in our jar, in our trust meaning moments. And my experience of people who have had major severe attachment trauma or severance of a parent, and that includes people who were adopted at birth because they were severed from their biological mother. That's just a fact, and some people don't really subscribe to that, but they were severed. They heard their mother's voice for 10 months and they heard her and they felt her, and she is who they know, and they no longer have her and they don't know why, and they internalize that. So back to the metaphor of this jar, if we have to put marbles in a jar to build trust, and someone has had major attachment fracture, it's like the jar has fractures in the bottom or cracks and the marbles fall out. So we have to be incredibly patient as parents who are trying to build trust that we do love them, that we aren't giving them the way, that we have unconditional regard for them, and that knowing that the marbles that we put in and that should be accumulating based on other people's relationships that you've had experience with, it doesn't. It doesn't accumulate. It's like the marbles fall right out the bottom. And so the importance of this part of the conversation is the person has to work to repair their jar, and that typically happens through therapy, trauma therapy with a really good bottom up trauma informed attachment specialist, so that they can help that person gain enough stability in the bottom of their jar so that the actions of the people today can hold. And I think that's probably the biggest misconception that parents will often have is, I have loved them so much and it doesn't seem to matter. They don't feel it. Yeah. And they don't act as if I am trustworthy based on what I'm seeing in their behavior. And so that's something that I think is really interesting and really common.
And again, just not taking anything personally.
And it's hard because it hurts when you love and you don't have that return, and they don't feel it.
Like, am I not doing it right? You know? And so do I need to do it differently or whatever? And I think too, with the unconditional love component, you're not disciplining them too and creating boundaries. So, I don't want people to think in saying, love them no matter what, and it doesn't mean let them do no matter what, because you're also teaching them about how to have boundaries in the world and how to have discipline, and those things are going to make them, successful in life outside your home.
Yeah. We know that this is a heavy topic. There's a lot to consider, and we're not trying to paint a picture that it's bad. We're just trying to paint a picture that you must be informed if you're going to choose to move forward with adopting and fostering. Can you talk a little bit about the state of affairs with children who need adoption, fostered, and fostering to transition to adoption, or any of that? What can you share with our audience if people are interested in this and they want to go forward with an informed approach? What can you share with them about this?
Sure. I mean, when we were considering adopting, we knew we wanted to just do it locally. And in our state, there's almost 20,000 kids who are in foster care, and 3,000 to 4,000 of them are already severed from their parents and available for adoption and free for adoption, so meaning it doesn't cost anything to the parents who are wanting to adopt them. And so obviously there's a great need for that. And for us, we went straight into foster to adoption. So really, the moment they moved in, it was like, okay, we're fostering you, but we're adopting you, like you're going to be ours. And during that time, they didn't know if that was going to happen or not. Right. So, without, talking to them now and asking them, now that they've had some distance from it, what was the hardest part of that? I think they probably would say, well, just not knowing if it's going to happen or not, or, screwing up, and then the people deciding they don't want you, or, whatever. And we just knew that it was the right thing. And so there was really nothing, they could do to, change our mind. And we really wanted to love them through that. But I know that can be a difficult transition for some families where the behavior could either be worse before the adoption or after.
Sure.
And I feel like for our kids, as soon as either we had an adoption date or the adoption happened, it was like physically you could see their bodies.
Like, this is final.
relax.
This is happening.
Yeah.
So they knew enough at their ages to know that meant this is kind of going to be our forever home. We're going to get to stay here.
Yeah. And I think, they want to be hopeful for that.
Sure.
But there's no guarantee of anything, especially if you get bounced around from, a foster family or a group home or, whatever the case may be. And so, there's some pains with that part of it. I mean, you have to go to a lot of classes, but that's temporary. I didn't particularly enjoy having people in my home inspecting things and having meetings. And there's a lot of different people you have to meet with and moving parts. But, again, all of that is temporary.
Sure.
And so it's so worth it to go through, to have these kids. You just, if they skin their knee, you got to have an incident report. It's like, well, I have 2 boys, so, I'm just constantly doing paperwork
all day long.
Yeah. So,
Right.
I was so happy when, the adoption was finalized and I didn't have to do any of that anymore.
Right.
I could take them to the doctor I wanted to take them to, the dentist I wanted to take them to, parent them in the way that I really wanted to, and without all of that. And I think, as much as all of those people are really part of the system and what's needed, having them around is like, oh, I'm still in the system. There's, there's
You're
something
still being watched.
Yeah.
And then you're in the situation of, are they going to think I'm a good enough parent to let me have these kids
right.
and whatnot?
Yeah.
You're
You almost
going
feel like you're in trouble because
Sure.
you're like, I'm being watched, and what if I, do something
Sure.
wrong, and
Yeah.
which is silly, but
Right.
It's just nice.
They're trying to protect the children
Right.
and make sure they place appropriately,
Right.
and that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
This is a hard process, but it's an incredibly rewarding process.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can attest to that. But we want to just make sure we talk about, it's important to have our own mental health support as the parents, and getting good trauma therapists to help your family with the adjustment. Self-care and those types of things are really essential to making this marathon runnable,
Yeah.
because it's a long process, and we really need to have patience with the process, with ourselves, with our children, if we're going through this, because it's tasking. It's not easy, and
It's parenting.
it's parenting.
So,
and it's
yeah.
parenting with variables that wouldn't
Yeah.
have necessarily otherwise existed from biological children, because they don't have that initial rupture in their attachment and their nervous system. So that's just something we need to understand and approach with love and compassion.
Yeah.
And that's what they deserve. And ultimately, they need our love, and they need a safe and stable home to grow up in. And so it's an incredibly wonderful thing to do for children in need. And so thank you for being one of those families. I really appreciate it.
I feel like if you feel like you have, love to share, and, you want to be a parent or a parent of more children or whatever, and you just have all this love that you want to give. I mean, these kids need families, and it's so beautiful. And now, I mean, my boys made me a mom, and I'm so proud of them. And, I feel like there was never life without them now. And so I think it's, in the end, absolutely one of the most beautiful things.
I can see your emotion being touched by that awareness and resilience. They're your babies. And even though they weren't your babies, they're your babies now. And that they do get embedded in our heart in that very same way. And although those emotions are sometimes a little bit different depending on biological versus adopted children, I think because having someone live in you, there is a different bond that can happen. There is no doubt that those children we choose make their way firmly into the depths of our heart with all of that love. And I think it's really beautiful and awesome. So thank you so much for sharing and being here with us and being vulnerable to talk about this really important topic. We will have some resources for you in our descriptions, but ultimately, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that this helped shed some light on things to consider if you are choosing to adopt or foster, and also normalize some of the things you may be experiencing because you've already chosen to go that route with your family growth. So hold on, let's cut that. So thank you so much again for being here. And until we meet again, don't forget to lead with love. It'll never steer you wrong.